Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Murder at Midnight Mass. The Miss Marple Mystery. Narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where we unravel mysteries with the keen eye of observation and the gentle wisdom of experience. I'm Connor, and tonight I invite you to join me as we follow the remarkable Miss Jane Marple through one of her most perplexing cases. Set against the sacred backdrop of Christmas Eve, this tale reminds us that even in our holiest moments, the darker aspects of human nature can emerge. So settle in with your favorite warm beverage as we witness how our beloved village sleuth untangles a web of deception woven within the hallowed walls of St. Mary Mead's Parish Church. Chapter 1. The Chalice of Death. The bells of St. Mary Mead Parish Church had never sounded more beautiful than they did on that crisp Christmas Eve of night. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen coat against the December chill as she made her way up the cobblestone path, her walking stick clicking rhythmically against the stone. The ancient church stood bathed in golden light from within, its stained glass windows casting jeweled patterns across the snow-dusted churchyard. At 82, Miss Marple had attended more Christmas Eve services than she cared to count, but tonight felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the unusually large congregation. Nearly every pew was filled with both familiar faces and visitors home for the holiday. Or perhaps it was the subtle tension she'd observed in the village over the past few weeks, the kind of undercurrent that her sharp eyes and keen understanding of human nature had learned to detect. The Reverend Leonard Clement greeted parishioners at the door with his customary warmth, though Miss Marple noticed a slight strain around his eyes. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. I trust you're well." "Quite well, thank you, Vicar. A beautiful evening for our service." She glanced past him into the nave, where candles flickered in their brass holders, casting dancing shadows across the medieval stonework. "I see we have quite a full house tonight." "Indeed, Christmas brings everyone home, doesn't it?" The vicar's smile didn't quite reach his eye. "I do hope the service brings peace to all who attend." Miss Marple made her way to her usual seat in the third pew, nodding to familiar neighbors. Mrs. Bantry waved from across the aisle, resplendent in her best hat with its rather ambitious feather arrangement. Haydock sat near the back, his medical bag discreetly placed beside him. Old habits, Miss Marple mused, died hard even on Christmas Eve. As the service began, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the front pew, where she observed a man she didn't immediately recognize. He was perhaps 60, well-dressed but somehow agitated, frequently checking his pocket watch and shifting in his seat. Something about his demeanor suggested a man carrying a heavy burden. The service proceeded with its familiar rhythm: carols, readings, prayers offered in the soft glow of candlelight. When the time came for communion, Miss Marple watched as the congregation began filing forward toward the altar rail. The stranger in the front pew was among the first to approach, kneeling at the carved wooden rail with his head bowed. The Reverend Clement blessed the bread and wine with practiced solemnity. Miss Marple observed as he lifted the ornate silver chalice, a piece that had served the church for over 3 centuries. The man in the front pew received the wine, and Miss Marple thought she saw his hand tremble slightly as he lifted the chalice to his lip. What happened next would remain etched in Miss Marple's memory for the rest of her days. The man had barely returned to his pew when he suddenly clutched at his throat, his face contorting in apparent agony. A strangled sound escaped him before he pitched forward, collapsing across the wooden seat with a sickening thud. The peaceful Christmas Eve service erupted into chaos. Several women screamed and people surged forward to help. Haydock immediately rushed from his seat, his medical bag in hand, pushing through the crowd gathering around the fallen man. "Everyone please step back," Dr. Haydock commanded, his voice cutting through the panic as he knelt beside the victim. Miss Marple, despite her age, had moved closer, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The man's face had turned an alarming shade of blue, and foam flecked his lips. Dr. Haydock quickly checked for a pulse, then began examining the victim with professional efficiency. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably no more than 2 minutes, he looked up gravely. "I'm afraid he's gone," Dr. Haydock announced quietly. "This appears to be some form of poisoning. The symptoms are quite distinctive." A collective gasp rose from the congregation. The Reverend Clement, his face ashen, moved to restore order. "Please everyone remain calm. We must contact the authorities immediately." Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with the methodical attention that had served her so well in previous mysteries. The silver chalice still sat on the altar, now seeming somehow ominous in the flickering candlelight. She noticed that the altar cloth beneath it bore a small dark stain. Wine, presumably, though she couldn't be certain. More importantly, she observed that while most of the congregation stood in shocked clusters, whispering among themselves, one person was missing from their previous position. The verger, Albert Morrison, who had been assisting with the service, was nowhere to be seen. As Dr. Haydock covered the body with his coat and the Reverend Clement began ushering people away from the altar area, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught something else, something that would prove crucial to unraveling this Christmas Eve tragedy. On the brass rail where the victim had knelt to receive communion, clearly visible in the soft light of the altar candles, was what appeared to be a single, deliberate fingerprint pressed into the metal polish. It was positioned in such a way that it could hardly be accidental. Someone had wanted that print to be found. The holy sanctuary of St. Mary Mead had become the scene of murder, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of her detective instinct. Christmas Eve would never be quite the same again. Chapter 2: Secrets in the Vestry. Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes of the emergency call, his usually stern expression even grimmer than usual as he surveyed the disrupted Christmas Eve service. The congregation had been moved to the parish hall next door, where they waited in subdued clusters, their holiday joy thoroughly dampened by the evening's tragic turn. Miss Marple had positioned herself strategically near the altar, close enough to observe the investigation, but far enough away to avoid immediate expulsion from the scene. Her reputation for solving crimes in Mary Mead had earned her a grudging tolerance from local law enforcement, though Inspector Slack remained perpetually skeptical of what he termed amateur interference. Right then, Inspector Slack announced to Dr. Haydock and the Reverend Clement, "What can you tell me about this fella?" He gestured toward the covered body. "His name was Reginald Fortescue," the Reverend replied, wringing his hands nervously. "He's been attending our services for the past 3 weeks, ever since he arrived in the village. Claimed to be researching his family genealogy. Apparently had ancestors buried in our churchyard." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. 3 weeks was hardly long enough to become deeply involved in village affairs. Yet someone had felt compelled to murder the man. Haydock cleared his throat. "The symptoms were consistent with cyanide poisoning, though I'll need a proper autopsy to confirm. The onset was rapid and fatal. Whoever did this knew their poisons." Inspector Slack made notes in his book. "And the communion wine, could it have been tampered with?" "That's what's peculiar," the Reverend said, glancing toward the altar. "The wine is kept in the vestry until just before the service. Only myself and our verger, Albert Morrison, have keys. The chalice was cleaned and filled not 20 minutes before communion began." "Where is this Morrison fellow?" Inspector Slack asked, looking around the nave. "I'm afraid I don't know," the Reverend admitted. "He was helping with the service, but in the confusion after Mr. Fortescue collapsed, he seems to have disappeared." Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. "If I might venture an observation, Inspector." Slack turned toward her with barely concealed exasperation. "Yes, Miss Marple. I couldn't help but notice that fingerprint on the communion ring. It appears to have been placed there quite deliberately, almost as if someone wanted it to be discovered. Inspector Slack followed her gaze to the brass rail, where the print was indeed clearly visible. Interesting. Could be the victim's own print, of course. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she doubted it. I also noticed that the altar cloth has a small stain beneath where the chalice was placed. It might be worth examining. Dr. Haydock nodded. If the wine was poisoned, there might be residue. As the inspector bent to examine the altar more closely, Miss Marple took the opportunity to study the vestry door, which stood slightly ajar. Something about its position troubled her in all her years of attending services. She'd never known the Reverend Clement to leave that door open during communion. "Reverend," she said quietly, "is the vestry door usually left open during the service?" The Reverend followed her gaze and frowned. "Certainly not. It should be locked. We keep valuable items in there. Historical documents, silver pieces, collection money." He moved quickly to check the door, then stopped abruptly. Good heavens, the lock's been forced. This revelation sent Inspector Slack hurrying to the vestry, with Miss Marple following despite his protests about contaminating the scene. The small room was in considerable disarray, papers scattered across the floor, drawers pulled open, and a small safe in the corner standing ajar. "Been ransacked," Inspector Slack observed grimly. "What's missing, Reverend?" The Reverend surveyed the chaos with growing alarm. "I'll need to check everything properly, but..." He moved to his desk and began shuffling through papers. "There's a letter missing, one that arrived from Fortescue yesterday. I kept it here because he wasn't staying at the inn, and I wasn't certain where to find him." "What sort of letter?" Miss Marple asked, her detective instincts fully aroused. "Official looking. From a solicitor's firm in London, I believe. It seemed important, so I thought it best to hold it securely." Inspector Slack made another note. "Any idea what it might have concerned?" Before the Reverend could answer, a voice called from the nave, "Inspector, I think you'd better see this." They returned to find Constable Jenkins holding up a small vial he'd discovered wedged between two prayer books in a nearby pew. The glass container was empty, but it still bore traces of what appeared to be a white crystalline residue. "Found this tucked away where someone clearly hoped it wouldn't be noticed," Jenkins reported. "Smells faintly of almonds." Dr. Haydock took the vial and examined it carefully. "Bitter almonds, that's cyanide. All right, this is almost certainly what killed poor Fortescue." Miss Marple found herself studying the pew where the vial had been found. It was 3 rows behind where she'd been sitting, in a section typically occupied by some of the village's more interesting residents. Miss Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed moral guardian, usually claimed that area, along with Colonel Melchett's elderly aunt, Miss Hartnell. But tonight Miss Marple realized that section had been occupied by people she didn't immediately recognize. Christmas visitors, most likely, though their identities would need to be established. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we need to identify everyone who attended tonight's service, particularly those sitting in the vicinity of where that vial was found." "Already on it," Slack replied, though his tone suggested he found the task daunting. "Problem is, half these people are visitors, family members home for Christmas, guests at the inn, that sort of thing. Going to take time to track them all down." As they spoke, the church door opened and Albert Morrison, the verger, entered quiet. He was a thin, nervous man in his 50s, and Miss Marple immediately noticed that his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his white surplice stained and his hands trembling. "Mr. Morrison," Inspector Slack called out sharply, "where have you..." Morrison started like a frightened rabbit. I was in the bell tower, Inspector. When all the commotion started, I went to ensure the tower door was properly locked. We've had problems with vandals recently." Miss Marple studied the man's face carefully. While his explanation was plausible, something about his manner suggested there was more to his story. The stains on his surplice looked remarkably like wine, and his nervousness seemed to go well beyond what the evening's tragedy would naturally inspire. The pieces of this Christmas Eve mystery were beginning to assemble themselves, but Miss Marple sensed that the most crucial revelations were yet to come. Chapter 3: The Letter That Vanished. The parish hall buzzed with hushed conversations as Inspector Slack began the delicate process of interviewing the disrupted congregation. Miss Marple had managed to secure a seat near the questioning area, ostensibly to provide comfort to distressed parishioners, but actually to observe the proceedings with her characteristic attention to detail. The first revelation came from Miss Bantry, who, despite her tendency toward dramatic flourishes, proved to have keen observational skills when it mattered. "I did notice something odd about that poor man," she told Inspector Slack, adjusting her elaborate hat. Before the service began, he was reading a letter quite intently, I might add. His face went perfectly white, and he kept glancing around the church as if he was looking for someone specific. "Did you see what became of this letter?" the inspector asked. "Well, that's just it. I saw him fold it up and put it in his jacket pocket, but when Dr. Haydock was examining the body, I couldn't help but notice that his jacket was hanging open and the pocket appeared to be empty." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Another missing letter. This made two that had vanished in connection with Mr. Fortescue, the solicitor's letter from the vestry, and now whatever correspondence had so distressed the victim just before his death. Inspector Slack's next interview was with Dr. Haydock, who provided a more clinical perspective on the evening's events. "The poison acted very quickly," the doctor explained. "From the time Fortescue took communion until his collapse was perhaps 3 minutes at most. Cyanide works fast, but this was remarkably rapid even by those standards." "Suggesting what?" the inspector prompted. "A highly concentrated dose, or possibly that it was mixed with alcohol to speed absorption. The communion wine would have served that purpose perfectly." Miss Marple found herself thinking about the logistics of the poisoning. The communion wine had been prepared in the vestry just 20 minutes before the service. The Reverend had stated that only he and Albert Morrison had keys to that room, yet someone had managed to contaminate the wine and ransack the vestry, all while a church full of people sat just outside. Her attention was drawn to the next interview subject. Miss Lavinia Fullerton, a sharp-eyed spinster who had recently moved to St. Mary Mead, and had been sitting in the front section of the church. "I positioned myself where I could observe the proceedings clearly," Miss Fullerton explained to Inspector Slack with a precision that reminded Miss Marple of herself. "I noticed that the deceased gentleman seemed quite agitated throughout the service. He kept checking his watch and looking toward the vestry door." "The vestry door," Inspector Slack repeated. "Why would he be interested in that?" "I couldn't say, but he seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. And I did see Albert Morrison enter and exit the vestry several times during the early part of the service, which struck me as unusual." This caught Miss Marple's attention. Morrison had claimed to be following his normal duties, but multiple trips to the vestry during the service seemed excessive. The verger himself was Inspector Slack's next subject, and Miss Marple watched him carefully as he approached the questioning area. Morrison's hands were still trembling, and he'd managed to acquire several more stains on his surplice. "Mr. Morrison," Inspector Slack began formally, "I need you to account for your movements this evening, particularly in relation to the vestry." Morrison dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. "Certainly, Inspector. I was preparing for the service as usual, filling the chalice, arranging the communion wafers, ensuring everything was properly set out. Miss Fullerton mentioned seeing you enter the vestry multiple times. Can you explain that?" The verger's color deepened. Well, there were several last-minute preparations. The wine needed to be decanted properly, and I thought I heard something in the vestry during the early hymns. Wanted to ensure everything was secure." Miss Marple noted the hesitation in his voice. Something about Morrison's story didn't ring true, though she couldn't yet put her finger on what was bothering her. "And after Mr. Fortescue collapsed," Inspector Slack continued,
I went immediately to check the bell tower. As I mentioned, we've had break-in attempts recently, and I thought it best to ensure the building was secure. Yet you have keys to the vestry, and that's where the break-in actually occurred, the inspector pointed out sharply. Morrison's face went pale. I didn't realize the vestry had been disturbed until you discovered it, Inspector. If I had known, I would have reported it immediately. Miss Marple found this explanation particularly unsatisfactory. A man responsible for church security wouldn't notice that the vestry door was ajar and the lock had been forced. The final interview of immediate importance was with the Reverend Clement himself, who appeared to be struggling with some internal conflict. Reverend, Inspector Slack said more gently, you mentioned that Mr. Fortescue had been attending services for 3 weeks. Did he seem particularly interested in anything or anyone during that time? The Reverend hesitated before answering. He asked many questions about the church's history, particularly about former parishioners and their families. He seemed especially interested in records from the 90s. Any particular reason? He claimed to be researching his family tree, as I mentioned, but the Reverend paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. But, Inspector Slack prompted. Yesterday, he approached me privately. He said he'd discovered something disturbing about one of our current parishioners. Something involving fraud and deception going back many years. He asked for my advice about what to do with this information. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. Here was the motive she'd been expecting. Fortescue had uncovered someone's secret, and that someone had killed him to keep it hidden. Did he tell you who this parishioner was? Inspector Slack asked urgently. The Reverend shook his head sadly. He said he needed to be absolutely certain before making any accusations. He planned to confront the person directly after tonight's service. The minister's voice dropped to a whisper. I advised him against. I told him that such matters were best handled through proper authorities, but he seemed determined to handle it himself. As the implications of this revelation settled over the room, Miss Marple found herself reviewing the evening's events with new understanding. Reginald Fortescue hadn't been a random victim. He'd been deliberately murdered by someone who knew he posed a threat to their carefully constructed life in St. Mary Mead. The question now was identifying which member of the congregation had been living a lie for the past 30 years. Chapter 4. Fingerprints and False Names. The next morning brought a thin coating of frost to St. Mary Mead, transforming the village into a crystalline wonderland that seemed to mock the previous evening's tragedy. Miss Marple, despite her advanced years, was up early, her mind too active for restful sleep. She made her way to the church where Inspector Slack and his team were conducting a more thorough examination of the crime scene in daylight. The inspector grudgingly acknowledged her presence with a nod. Miss Marple, I suppose you've been thinking about this case all night. Indeed I have, Inspector, and I believe I may have some insights that could prove helpful. She gestured toward the communion rail where the mysterious fingerprint remained clearly visible. Have you had that print examined yet? Sending it to London for analysis. But that will take several days. Christmas holidays, you know. Miss Marple approached the rail and studied the print carefully through her spectacles. I wonder, Inspector, if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity and dust for other prints in this area. Other prints, on the chalice itself for instance. If the wine was poisoned, someone had to handle that vessel. Inspector Slack considered this, then nodded to Constable Jenkins, who produced a dusting kit from his bag. The silver chalice revealed several partial prints around its rim and base, but one set stood out with startling clarity on the stem prints that had apparently been deliberately pressed into the metal to ensure they would be found. Whoever did this wanted us to find their fingerprints, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. The question is why? Dr. Haydock arrived as they were examining the chalice, carrying his preliminary autopsy findings. Definitely cyanide, he confirmed. Highly concentrated, and mixed with something to mask the bitter taste. Honey, I believe. Whoever prepared this knew their chemistry. Miss Marple filed this information away. Doctor, would such knowledge be common among our parishioners? Not particularly. You'd need some background in chemistry, or perhaps pharmacy, or... He paused, frowning. Actually, now that I think of it, cyanide was widely used in photography until recently. Anyone involved in developing photographs might know how to obtain and concentrate it. This opened an intriguing possibility. Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate who among the congregation might have photographic interest. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegraph boy, who handed Inspector Slack a message with obvious relief at finding him so easily. The inspector read it with growing interest. Well, he said finally. Seems our Mr. Fortescue wasn't who he claimed to be. This is from Scotland Yard. His real name was Reginald Fairfax, and he was a private investigator specializing in fraud cases. Miss Marple wasn't entirely surprised by this revelation. That would explain his interest in 30-year-old records, wouldn't? He wasn't researching his own family. He was investigating someone else's. But who was his target? Inspector Slack wondered aloud. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, we should examine those missing letters more carefully. If we can determine what Fairfax discovered, we may identify his killer. They made their way to the vestry, where the Reverend Clement was attempting to restore order to the scattered papers. He looked up as they entered, his face drawn with exhaustion. Any luck determining what was taken? Inspector Slack asked. It's difficult to say precisely, but I believe several items are missing. The letter for Mr. Fortescue, or Mr. Fairfax as you now tell me, some old parish records from the 1920s, and... He hesitated, clearly troubled. A photograph that was kept with the historical document. What sort of photograph? A group picture from a church social in 1923. I remember it because it included several families who were prominent in the village at that time. Some of their descendants still live here. Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle that told her they were approaching something important. Reverend, do you recall who was in that photograph? Several families, the Hartnells, the Weatherbys, the Prices, and... He frowned with concentration. The Morrison family. Yes, Albert's father was the verger before him. It was quite a tradition in their family. Inspector Slack and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Albert Morrison's behavior the previous evening suddenly seemed more significant. Where might we find Albert this morning? The inspector up. He should be here soon for his regular duties. Christmas Day requires considerable preparation, even under these circumstances. As if summoned by their conversation, Morrison appeared in the vestry doorway. His appearance was even more disheveled than the previous evening, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands were stained with what appeared to be developing chemicals. Mr. Morrison, Inspector Slack said formally, I need to ask you some additional questions, particularly about your whereabouts yesterday afternoon. Morrison's nervousness was immediately apparent. Yesterday afternoon? I was at home preparing for the evening service. Anyone who can verify that?
Why, no, I live alone. My sister visits sometimes, but not yesterday. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. Mr. Morrison, I couldn't help but notice the stains on your hands. Have you been doing photographic work recently? The verger started as if she'd struck him. Yes, I develop photographs as a hobby. Nothing unusual about that. Indeed not, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, though I understand photographic chemicals can be quite dangerous if not handled properly. One must be very careful with substances like cyanide compounds. Morrison's face went ashen. I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but... I'm not implying anything, my dear man. I'm simply observing that you have access to dangerous chemicals. You have keys to the vestry where the communion wine was prepared, and you seem remarkably nervous for someone who should be grieving the loss of a fellow parishioner. Inspector Slack had been taking notes throughout this exchange. "Mr. Morrison, I think you'd better come down to the station with me. There are quite a few questions that need answering." As Morrison was led away, Miss Marple turned to the Reverend. "That photograph from 1923, do you recall anything unusual about it? Any reason why someone might want it destroyed?" The Reverend thought carefully. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something odd. One of the families in the photograph, I believe it was the Morrisons, the caption underneath had been altered. Someone had scratched out part of the name and written in different letters." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in her mind. A private investigator, a 30-year-old secret, a photograph with an altered caption, and a verger with access to both poison and the crime scene. But she sensed there was still more to discover before the full truth would emerge. Chapter 5. The Altered Parish Registry. Christmas morning dawned grey and sombre over St. Mary Mead, the festive spirit of the season overshadowed by the previous evening's tragedy. Miss Marple had spent a restless night piecing together the fragments of information she'd gathered, and by dawn she had formed a theory that demanded investigation. She arrived at the police station just as Inspector Slack was beginning his formal interrogation of Albert Morris. The verger sat in the interview room looking thoroughly defeated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to stop their trembling. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack acknowledged her presence with resignation. "I suppose you'll want to observe this interview. If you don't mind, Inspector. I believe Mr. Morrison's story may be more complex than it initially appears." Morrison looked up at her with desperate eyes. "Miss Marple, you must believe me. I never meant for anyone to die. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. "So you admit to poisoning the communion wine?" "No." Morrison's denial was immediate and fervent. "I mean, yes, I did tamper with the wine, but not with poison. I added a mild sedative, something to make Mr. Fairfax drowsy so he wouldn't be able to confront anyone publicly after the service." Miss Marple studied the man's face carefully. Despite everything, she found herself believing this particular claim. "What sort of sedative, Mr. Morrison?" "Something I use sometimes when my nerves are bad. A doctor in the next village prescribed it years ago. Just a few drops in the wine. I thought it would make him confused, perhaps cause him to postpone whatever he was planning to do." Inspector Slack was skeptical. "And how exactly did you know that Fairfax was planning something?" Morrison's shoulders sat. "Because he came to see me 3 days ago. He said he'd been investigating irregularities in the parish records. Going back to the 1920s, he'd discovered something about my family that could ruin everything." "What sort of irregularities?" Miss Marple asked gently. The verger was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My father wasn't really a Morrison. His real name was Maurice Hartwell, and he'd been involved in a financial scandal in London in 1920. Mary Mead and assumed a new identity, taking the name of a family that had recently died in an influenza outbreak." This revelation explained much of what had puzzled Miss Marple. "And your father became the verger under this false name?" "The previous verger had died, and my father presented himself as an experienced church worker seeking a new position. No one questioned his credentials too closely in those days. The village needed a verger, and he needed a job and a place to hide." Inspector Slack made note, and Fairfax discovered this deception. He'd been going through old parish records, comparing entries with national records in London. He found discrepancies in the dates, inconsistencies in the family information. When he showed me what he'd discovered, I realized it was only a matter of time before the whole story came out. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, did you take that photograph from the vestry? The one showing your family?" Morrison nodded miserably. "The caption had been altered years ago. Someone had scratched out Hartwell and written Morrison above it. If anyone looked closely at that photograph in connection with Mr. Fairfax's investigation, they'd see the alteration immediate." "But you didn't poison the communion wine," Miss Marple pressed. "You added a sedative, but someone else added the cyanide. That's exactly what I'm saying. I went to the vestry about 20 minutes before communion, added just a few drops of my medication to the wine, and locked the door again. When I returned later to help serve communion, the vestry had been broken into, and the room was in chaos. Inspector Slack frowned. You're claiming someone else was in the vestry after you? They must have been. I would have noticed if the room had been ransacked when I was there adding the sedative. Miss Marple found this account troubling but believable. Morrison was clearly guilty of tampering with the communion wine, but his motivation was concealment rather than murder. Someone else had discovered his plan and used it as cover for a more sinister purpose. Miss Morrison, she said carefully during the service, did you notice anyone else showing unusual interest in the vestry area? The verger thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, yeah. Miss Fullerton, the lady who recently moved to the village, she seemed to be watching the vestry door very intently during the early part of the service, and she left her seat at one point supposedly to use the facilities, but I noticed she was gone for quite a long time. This was a new piece of information that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Miss Lavinia Fullerton had presented herself as merely an observant witness, but her behavior suggested she might have been more involved than she'd admitted. Inspector, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, I think we need to have another conversation with Miss Fullerton, and perhaps we should examine the parish records more carefully to understand exactly what Mr. Fairfax discovered. They made their way back to the church, where the Reverend Clement was attempting to prepare for a subdued Christmas Day service despite the circumstances. He looked up as they entered, his face reflecting the strain of the past 12 hours. Reverend, Miss Marple began, could you show us those parish registers from the 1920s? I think we need to understand exactly what discrepancies Mr. Fairfax uncovered. The registers revealed a fascinating story when examined carefully. The entries for 1923 showed clear evidence of alteration, names changed, dates adjusted, and entire entries that appeared to have been written over earlier text. Someone went to considerable trouble to rewrite these records, Inspector Slack observed. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but the alterations weren't made recently. This work was done decades ago, probably shortly after the original entries were made. The Reverend studied the pages with growing concern. I had no idea these records had been tampered with. This calls into question the validity of numerous baptisms, marriages, and burials recorded during that period. Miss Marple turned to a specific page that had caught her attention. Inspector, look at this entry carefully. It records the marriage of Lawrence Fullerton to Margaret Hartwell in September 1923. Inspector Slack looked up sharply. Fullerton, as in our Miss Lavinia Fullerton? I believe so, and noticed that the bride's surname has been altered from Hartwell to Morrison, in a different ink. The implications were staggering. Not only had Morrison's father assumed a false identity, but it appeared that Miss Fullerton was connected to the original Hartwell family, possibly even Maurice Hartwell's daughter. We need to speak with Miss Fullerton immediately, Inspector Slack declared, but as he spoke, Constable Jenkins appeared in the church doorway with urgent news. Inspector, sir, Miss Fullerton has disappeared. The landlady at her boarding house says she packed her bags early this morning and left without paying her bill. Left this behind though. He held up a leather portfolio stuffed with papers. Miss Marple accepted the portfolio and began examining its contents. Inside were photographs, letters and what appeared to be private investigator reports spanning several years. As she read, the full scope of the deception began to emerge. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe we've been looking at this case from entirely the wrong angle. Chapter 6. The Photographer's Dark Secret. The portfolio Miss Fullerton had left behind contained revelations that would reshape their entire understanding of the Christmas Eve murder. Miss Marple spread the contents across one of the church pews, organizing the documents with the methodical care of a librarian cataloguing precious manuscripts. Look at this, she said, holding up a photograph that appeared to be several decades old. It's the same church social picture that was stolen from the vestry, but this is obviously the original before the caption was altered. Inspector Slack examined the photograph closely.
In it, a group of well-dressed parishioners posed in front of the church. The caption clearly read, Mary Mead Church Social, June 1923. Front row, Lawrence and Margaret Hartwell, Albert Morrison Sr., Reverend Phillips. Back row, various parishioners. So the Hartwells were the original family, Inspector Slack observed. But I thought Morrison said his father assumed the Morrison name. Miss Marple pointed to another document in the portfolio. I think Mr. Morrison was confused about some of the details. According to this investigation report, there were two deceptions occurring simultaneously. Maurice Hartwell did assume the Morrison identity, but Lawrence Hartwell, his brother, remained in the village under his own name until his death in 1925. The implication was staggering. The Hartwell family hadn't disappeared entirely from Mary Mead. They'd simply split their identities to avoid the scandal that had driven them from London. Dr. Haydock, who had been following their investigation with professional interest, studied the documents over Miss Marple's shoulder. This suggests that Miss Fullerton might be Lawrence Hartwell's daughter, making her Morrison's cousin. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed, and if you look at these letters, it becomes clear that she hired Mr. Fairfax to investigate what happened to her family's reputation and fortune. The letters revealed a bitter story spanning 3 decades. The Hartwell family had been prosperous London merchants until a financial scandal in 1922 destroyed their business and social standing. Lawrence Hartwell had fled to Mary Mead with his pregnant wife, while his brother Maurice had assumed the Morrison identity to work as the church verger. But why would Miss Fullerton want to murder the investigator she hired? Inspector Slack wondered. Miss Marple continued reading through the correspondence. According to these letters, Mr. Fairfax discovered something that Miss Fullerton hadn't expected. Evidence that her father Lawrence wasn't innocent in the original scandal. In fact, it appears he was the primary perpetrator, and his brother Maurice was merely a victim, who got caught up in the consequences. The portfolio contained copies of bank records and business documents that painted Lawrence Hartwell as an embezzler, who had stolen thousands of pounds from client accounts. When the scheme collapsed, he'd allowed his brother to take much of the blame while he escaped to start over in Mary Mead. Dr. Haydock whistled softly. So Miss Fullerton spent years believing her father was wrongly accused, only to discover he was actually guilty. Worse than that, Miss Marple said, examining the final document in the portfolio. Mr. Fairfax had traced what happened to the stolen money. Lawrence Hartwell had hidden it in various accounts, and when he died in 1925, the money passed to his daughter through a series of trust funds and investments. Inspector Slack's eyes widened. You mean Miss Fullerton has been living off stolen money her entire life, unknowingly, until Miss Fairfax revealed the truth? According to this final letter from him, he intended to expose not only the original theft, but also demand that she make restitution to the families who were wronged. That would have meant returning virtually everything she owed. The motive for murder was becoming crystal clear. Miss Fullerton hadn't killed to protect a family secret. She'd killed to protect her entire way of life, built as it was on the proceeds of her father's crimes. But how did she manage to poison the communion wine? Inspector Slack asked. Morrison admitted to tampering with it, but he only added a sedative. Miss Marple had been puzzling over this aspect of the crime. I think we need to examine the timeline more carefully. Morrison added his sedative about 20 minutes before communion began. The vestry was then broken into, but when they returned to the vestry, where Miss Marple began a more detailed examination of the crime scene, the lock had been forced, but with considerable skill. This wasn't the work of a casual vandal. Inspector, look at this, she said, pointing to scratches on the door frame. These tool marks are fresh, but notice how precise they are. This lock was picked by someone with considerable expertise. Dr. Haydock joined their examination. The question is when this occurred. If it happened after Morrison added the sedative, Miss Fullerton would have had access to wine that was already tampered with. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. She could have added the cyanide to wine that already contained Morrison's sedative, creating a deadly cocktail that would work much faster than either substance alone. But a new puzzle presented itself. If Miss Fullerton had already fled the village, Inspector Slack pointed out, how do we prove she was the one who actually administered the poison? The answer came from an unexpected source. The Reverend Clement, who had been quietly listening to their discussion, suddenly spoke up. I've just remembered something, he said. During the service, just before communion began, I noticed someone had left a small vial on the altar. I thought it was perhaps a medication that someone had accidentally dropped, so I moved it aside, but when I looked for it after Miss Fairfax collapsed, it was gone. Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of pieces falling into place. Miss Fullerton didn't need to tamper with the wine in the vestry at all. She added the cyanide directly to the chalice during the service, right there at the altar where everyone could see her, but no one would think to question her actions. The boldness of it was breathtaking. Miss Fullerton had poisoned the communion wine in plain sight of the entire congregation, secure in the knowledge that her position as a visiting worshipper would make her above suspicion. But the fingerprints on the communion rail, Inspector Slack remembered. She deliberately left those to implicate someone else. Miss Marple smiled grimly. I suspect if we examine those prints more carefully, we'll find they belong to Albert Morris. Miss Fullerton probably obtained them from something he'd handled, a hymnal perhaps, or the collection plate, and transferred them to the brass rail to create false evidence. The picture was now complete, but Miss Fullerton had escaped justice by fleeing in the early hours of Christmas morning, or so it seemed. Chapter 7: The Christmas Morning Confession. Miss Marple's satisfaction at solving the puzzle of the Christmas Eve murder was tempered by the knowledge that the perpetrator had escaped. As Christmas morning progressed, it seemed increasingly likely that Miss Lavinia Fullerton had successfully fled Mary Mead, leaving behind only the portfolio of evidence that revealed her motive, but couldn't prove her guilt. Inspector Slack had issued alerts to all nearby railway stations, and posted constables at the main roads leading out of the village, but these seemed like futile gestures. A determined criminal with several hours' head start could easily have reached London, or any number of coastal towns where she might book passage abroad. It was therefore with considerable surprise that Miss Marple received a telephone call just after midday from an unexpected source. Miss Marple, the voice was cultured but strained, immediately recognizable despite the circumstances. This is Lavinia Fullerton. I understand you've been investigating last night's incident. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm and steady. Miss Fullerton, how unexpected to hear from you. I trust you're well. I'm at the railway station in Much Benham, waiting for the London train. I wanted to speak with you before I left permanently. There was a pause. Then I assume you've discovered the truth by now. Some of it certainly. Perhaps you'd care to fill in the remaining details. Miss Marple could hear the sound of a train whistle in the background, followed by what might have been a bitter laugh. The irony is that I spent 30 years believing my father was an innocent victim of circumstances, only to discover that he was the true villain in the piece. Mr. Fairfax was very thorough in his investigation, too thorough for my peace of mind. You hired him to clear your father's name, Miss Marple observed. Indeed, I've spent decades fighting to restore the Hartwell reputation, never realizing that there was nothing to restore. When Miss Fairfax presented me with evidence of my father's embezzlement, I realized that everything I'd built my life upon was fraudulent. Miss Marple found herself feeling an unexpected sympathy for the woman, despite the terrible crime she'd committed. That must have been devastating to discover. Devastating enough to drive me to murder, as you've no doubt concluded. Miss Fullerton's voice carried a note of weary resignation. But I want you to understand that it wasn't just about protecting my reputation, or my inheritance. Mr. Fairfax intended to expose not only my father's crimes, but also to demand that I make restitution to all the families who had been wronged. That would have been the honorable course of action, Miss Marple said gently. But it would have left me destitute, And more importantly, it would have destroyed Albert Morrison and his family. You see, Miss Marple, Maurice Morrison, Albert's father, wasn't guilty of the embezzlement. He was merely a clerk who got caught up in my father's scheme. The poor man spent the rest of his life in hiding for crimes he didn't commit. This revelation added another layer of tragedy to an already complex case. Miss Marple began to understand why Miss Fullerton had felt compelled to act so drastically. So you decided to silence Fairfax before he could reveal the truth. I planned it carefully, Miss Fullerton admitted. I knew that Albert Morrison was nervous about the investigation. He'd approached me several times, worried about what might be discovered about his father. When I learned that he was planning to drug the communion wine to prevent Mr. Fairfax from making any public revelations, I saw my opportunity. You used his plan as cover for your own more sinister purpose. Precise. I knew that a mild sedative wouldn't be fatal, but cyanide mixed with the wine and Albert's medication would work very quickly. I also knew that Albert would be blamed for the death, which would silence him permanently as well. Miss Marple could hear the sound of the approaching train growing louder. Miss Fullerton, why are you telling me this? Surely it would be safer to simply disappear without confession. There was a long pause before the reply came. Because I'm tired, Miss Marple. Tired of living with lies and secrets. Tired of protecting a reputation that wasn't worth protecting. And because Albert Morrison doesn't deserve to hang for my crime. Where are you going? I have a sister in Australia who knows nothing about the family history. I'll make a new life there if possible, but first, I wanted to ensure that the truth was known, all of it. Miss Marple could hear the train pulling into the station. Miss Fullerton, I must ask, how did you manage to poison the wine during the service itself? Quite simple, really. During the processional hymn, I approached the altar under pretense of retrieving a dropped glove. I had the cyanide prepared in a small vial, and it took only seconds to add it to the chalice. The lighting was dim, and everyone's attention was on the hymn book and the fingerprints on the communion rail. I'd obtained Albert's prints from a collection plate he'd handled earlier, using a technique I'd learned during my years of amateur detective work. I pressed them onto the brass rail to ensure he would be implicated. The train whistle grew louder, signaling imminent departure. Miss Fullerton, Miss Marple said urgently, you could return to the village, confess properly to the authorities. The circumstances might warrant some leniency. I'm afraid not, Miss Marple. I've committed murder, and no amount of explanation can excuse that. But please ensure that Albert Morrison is cleared of all charges. He's guilty of nothing more than trying to protect his family's secret. A secret that should never have been necessary in the first place. The line went dead, leaving Miss Marple staring at the telephone with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The mystery was solved, but justice remained elusive. She immediately telephoned Inspector Slack to relay Miss Fullerton's confession, knowing that it would be sufficient to clear Albert Morrison of murder charges, while ensuring that the true circumstances of the crime were properly documented. As she hung up the phone, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste of it all. 2 families destroyed by one man's greed, 30 years ago, leading inexorably to murder on Christmas Eve. The sins of one generation had indeed visited themselves upon the next, with devastating consequences for all involved. Chapter 8. The Verger's Vindication. The afternoon of Christmas Day found Inspector Slack in the unusual position of releasing a murder suspect and issuing apologies for false imprisonment. Albert Morrison emerged from the police station a free man, though his ordeal had clearly taken a considerable toll on his physical and emotional state. Miss Marple was waiting for him outside the station, having anticipated that he might need both practical support and someone to talk through the implications of Miss Fullerton's confession. The verger approached her hesitantly, his face bearing the grey pallor of a man who had spent a sleepless night contemplating the gallows. Miss Marple, he said quietly, Inspector Slack told me about Miss Fullerton's telephone call. I don't know how to thank you. No thanks are necessary, Mr. Morrison. The truth has a way of emerging eventually, though I'm sorry it took so long in this case. They walked slowly toward the church, where the bells were ringing for the evening Christmas service, a subdued affair, given the circumstances, but one that the Reverend Clement felt was necessary to help the community process the trauma of the previous evening. "I need to understand something," Morrison said as they walked. "Miss Fullerton said she did all this to protect my father's reputation, but he'd been dead for nearly 30 years. What did it matter anymore?" Miss Marple considered her response carefully. "I think Miss Fullerton's motives were more complex than she admitted, even to herself. Yes, she wanted to protect your father's memory, but she also wanted to protect herself from the consequences of learning that her entire life had been built on stolen money." Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing this. "You mean she killed Mr. Fairfax to avoid having to give back money that rightfully belonged to other people?" "Partly, yes, but I also think she was trying to preserve a version of her family history that she'd spent decades believing in. Sometimes people will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid facing uncomfortable truths about those they love." As they reached the church, Morrison paused at the gate, looking up at the building where he'd served faithfully for so many years. "Miss Marple, do you think I should continue as verger, after everything that's happened, all the secrets that have come to light? Perhaps the church would be better served by someone without such a complicated history." Miss Marple studied his face with the compassionate understanding that had made her such an effective solver of human puzzles. "Mr. Morrison, your father made mistakes 30 years ago, but he also spent the remainder of his life serving this community faithfully. You've continued that service with dedication and integrity. The sins of one generation needn't define the next, unless we choose to let them. But everyone will know now about the false identity, about the deception. Everyone will know that your father was forced to assume a false name to escape persecution for crimes he didn't commit. There's quite a difference between being a victim of circumstances and being a perpetrator of fraud." Inspector Slack approached them as they stood by the church gate, carrying the portfolio that Miss Fullerton had abandoned. "Morrison," he said with uncharacteristic gentleness, "I wanted to return these to you. Miss Fullerton left instructions that any documents relating to your family should be given to you." Morrison accepted the portfolio with trembling hands. What should I do with all this?" Miss Marple looked at the portfolio thoughtfully. "I think you should read through everything carefully when you're ready, understand the full truth about what happened to your family, then decide for yourself what parts of that history deserve to be preserved, and what parts should be left in the past." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know, Morrison. We've received word from the railway authority. Miss Fullerton never boarded the train to London. She was found this morning on the platform at Much Benham Station, apparently having suffered a heart attack while waiting for the train." The news struck Miss Marple with unexpected force. "She's dead?" "I'm afraid so. The station master said she seemed to be in considerable distress when she arrived, and she collapsed shortly after making a telephone call. The doctor said it was likely brought on by the stress of the situation." Morrison looked stricken. "She died because of secrets my family should have resolved decades ago. She died because she made a choice to commit murder rather than face the truth about her circumstances," Miss Marple said firmly. "That was her decision, not yours or your father's." As they entered the church for the evening service, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of Miss Fullerton's fate. The woman had killed to avoid the consequences of her father's crimes, only to die before she could escape those consequences herself. The church was fuller than might have been expected for a Christmas evening service, following such traumatic events. Word had spread through the village about Morrison's vindication and Miss Fullerton's confession, and there seemed to be a collective desire to demonstrate support for their long-time verger. The Reverend Clement addressed the congregation with unusual directness about the previous day's event. "We gather tonight in the shadow of tragedy," he began, "but also in the light of truth finally revealed. We have learned that appearances can be deceiving, that secrets kept for decades can poison the present, and that the search for justice sometimes leads us down dark paths.
Miss Marple watched Morrison throughout the service, noting how his posture gradually straightened as he went about his familiar duties. The man who had entered the church bent with shame and fear was beginning to recover his dignity. As the service concluded and the congregation began to disperse, several parishioners made a point of speaking with Morrison, offering words of support and reassurance. Miss Bantry, never one to be outdone in expressions of community solidarity, announced loudly that she had never doubted Albert's innocence for a moment, and that anyone who knew him properly could see he hadn't a violent bone in his body. Miss Marple smiled at this revisionist history but appreciated the sentiment behind it. The mystery of the Christmas Eve murder was solved, but its resolution had revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice, the weight of family secrets, and the prices people are willing to pay to preserve their versions of the truth. Chapter 9. The Communion of 3 weeks after the Christmas Eve tragedy, life in St. Mary Mead had begun to settle into something approaching its normal rhythm. The sensational aspects of the murder had been thoroughly discussed, dissected, and gradually absorbed into the village's collective memory, where they would no doubt be retold and embellished for generations to come. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a surprisingly mild January morning, tending to her winter roses and reflecting on the lessons learned from the recent events. The Reverend Clement had called to see her, bringing news of developments that had emerged in the aftermath of Miss Fullerton's confession and subsequent death. "The solicitors have been remarkably efficient," the Reverend reported, settling into the garden chair Miss Marple had offered. "Miss Fullerton's estate is being administered according to very specific instructions she left with her London lawyer." Miss Marple looked up from her pruning with interest. "She arranged for the entirety of her inheritance, everything that could be traced back to her father's embezzlement, to be distributed among the families who were wronged 30 years ago. The amounts, adjusted for inflation, are quite substantial." Miss Marple felt a surge of respect for the dead woman, so she found a way to make restitution after all. "Indeed, and there's more. She left a considerable sum specifically for the restoration of church records damaged by her actions, along with funds to properly maintain the parish registry going forward." The Reverend paused, clearly struggling with some complex emotion. "I find myself in the peculiar position of admiring someone who committed murder in my own church." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears and considered this carefully. "I think Miss Fullerton was a woman who made one terrible choice when confronted with an impossible situation. The fact that she ultimately did the right thing regarding the stolen money doesn't excuse the murder, but it does suggest that her fundamental character wasn't entirely corrupt. Albert Morrison has decided to stay on as verger," the Reverend continued. "He's been quite transformed by the whole experience, actually. He's asked to help with research into the parish's historical records, to ensure that any other irregularities are identified and corrected properly." Miss Marple smiled at this news. "I think that's an excellent decision. There's something to be said for facing history honestly rather than allowing secrets to fester." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who had developed the habit of consulting Miss Marple on the more perplexing aspects of his case. He approached through the garden gate with his customary expression of professional skepticism tinged with grudging respect. "Miss Marple, Reverend," he nodded to both, "I wanted to update you on the final resolution of the Fairfax case." He pulled out his notebook and consulted it briefly. "The investigation into Fairfax's background has revealed quite an interesting story. He wasn't just any private investigator, he specialized in historical fraud cases, particularly those involving families who had assumed false identities to escape financial scandal." "How did he come to focus on the Hartwell family?" Miss Marple asked. "Apparently he'd been hired by several different parties over the years to investigate various aspects of the 90s. The Hartwell case kept appearing in his research and he became convinced that there were significant discrepancies in the official records. Inspector Slack flipped a page in his notebook. What's particularly interesting is that he'd identified at least 3 other families who had fled London after the scandal and assumed new identities in small villages around England. The Hartwells were just one part of a much larger pattern. The Reverend looked troubled. You mean there are other villages dealing with similar secrets? Not dealing with them, ignoring them. In most cases the original perpetrators died long ago, and their descendants have been living quiet, law-abiding lives under their assumed name. Fairfax seems to have been particularly focused on the Hartwell case, because it involved the largest amount of stolen money. Miss Marple found this information fascinating but troubling. Inspector, what happens to those other families now? Will they be exposed as well? That's largely up to the authorities in each jurisdiction. Fairfax left very detailed files, but there's some question about whether pursuing 30-year-old identity fraud cases serves any useful purpose when the original crimes can no longer be prosecuted. As Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple and the Reverend continued their discussion about the broader implications of what they'd learned. It makes one wonder, the Reverend mused, how many other secrets are hidden in parish records across England? How many families are living under names and identities that aren't originally their own? Miss Marple had been pondering similar questions. I suppose the real issue isn't whether people have secrets, but what they're willing to do to protect those secrets. The Morrison family lived quietly under their assumed name for decades without harming anyone. It was only when that secret was threatened with exposure that tragedy resulted, and Miss Fullerton was faced with a choice between accepting responsibility for her father's crimes and committing a crime of her own. She chose wrongly, but at least she eventually found a way to make amends for her father's action. As the afternoon wore on and their conversation drew to a close, Miss Marple reflected on the complex moral landscape that the Christmas Eve murder had revealed. The case had involved questions of inherited guilt, the weight of family secrets, and the prices people are willing to pay to preserve their version of the truth. In the end, justice had been served in an unconventional way, not through the courts, but through the conscience of a woman who chose to make restitution even as she fled from prosecution for murder. The bells of Mary Mead Church began ringing the evening call to service, and Miss Marple found herself thinking about the communion chalice that had been the instrument of death on Christmas Eve. The chalice had been thoroughly cleaned and reconsecrated, but she suspected it would be many years before the parishioners could receive communion without remembering the tragedy that had unfolded around that sacred ritual. Truth, like wine, could be both blessing and poison depending on how it was administered and received. Chapter 10, The Final Thread. Spring had returned to Mary Mead by the time Miss Marple felt ready to set down her final thoughts on what the village had come to call the Christmas Eve mystery. The daffodils were blooming in cottage gardens, and the ancient church stood serene in the morning sunlight, showing no outward signs of the drama that had unfolded within its walls 4 months earlier. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, composing a letter to her nephew Raymond, who had expressed curiosity about the case after reading a brief mention of it in the London newspaper. She found herself choosing her words carefully, aware that the full truth contained lessons that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Reginald Fairfax's death. The most troubling aspect of this case, she wrote, was not the murder itself but the chain of deceptions that made murder seem necessary to someone who was not, by nature, a violent person. She paused in her writing to look out the window toward the church where Albert Morrison could be seen tending the flower beds around the entrance. The man had indeed been transformed by his ordeal, becoming more confident in his role and more open about his family's history. The truth, however painful, had proven liberating in ways that decades of secrecy had not. Miss Fullerton's tragedy, Miss Marple continued in her letter, was that she spent 30 years fighting to vindicate her father, only to discover that he was guilty of everything she'd tried to deny. When faced with that truth, she chose to compound one generation's crimes with her own, rather than accept the responsibility that came with her inheritance. The front gate clicked, and Miss Marple looked up to see the Reverend Clement approaching through her garden. She set aside her letter and went to greet him, noting that he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple," he said with evident pleasure, I have something I think you'll find interesting. He handed her the package, which proved to contain a leather-bound journal. This arrived yesterday from Miss Fullerton's solicitor. Apparently she left instructions that it should be given to you if anything happened to her. Miss Marple opened the journal with considerable curiosity. The pages contained Miss Fullerton's own account of the events leading up to the Christmas Eve murder, written with the careful precision of someone accustomed to documenting evidence. She must have prepared this as a form of insurance, Miss Marple observed as she read through the opening pages, a complete confession with detailed explanations of her motives and methods. The journal revealed aspects of Miss Fullerton's character that had been hidden during their brief acquaintance. She was clearly an intelligent and educated woman who had devoted considerable time and resources to researching her family's history. Her dedication to clearing her father's name had been genuine, making her ultimate discovery of his guilt all the more devastating. "Listen to this passage," Miss Marple said, reading aloud. "I realize now that I was not seeking justice but vindication. I wanted to prove that my father was a victim not because the evidence supported that conclusion, but because I needed to believe it. When Miss Fairfax presented me with irrefutable proof of my father's guilt, I felt as though my entire life had been built on quicksand." The Reverend nodded sadly. "It's a remarkably honest piece of self-examination." Miss Marple continued reading. Here she writes, "I told myself that I was killing Miss Fairfax to protect Albert Morrison and his family from the consequences of my father's crimes. But if I'm completely honest, I was trying to protect myself from having to face the truth about who my father really was, and what that made me." The journal went on to detail Miss Fullerton's careful planning of the murder, including her observation of Morrison's nervous behavior, and her deduction that he was planning some form of intervention. She had recognized an opportunity to commit murder while ensuring that someone else would be blamed for the crime. "What's particularly chilling," Miss Marple observed, "is how methodically she approached it. She writes about obtaining Morrison's fingerprints, preparing the cyanide, and timing her approach to the altar as though she were describing a chemistry experiment. But the final entries in the journal revealed a different side of Miss Fullerton's character. As she waited for the train that would take her away from St. Mary Mead, she had apparently experienced something approaching a moral awakening. "I cannot escape the knowledge that I have become exactly what I spent 30 years denying my father was, a person who destroys others to protect herself." Miss Marple read, "The only difference is that he stole money while I stole a life. I am not sure which crime is worse." The Reverend was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Do you think she intended to die at the railway station? Her heart attack seems almost too convenient." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I think she was a woman under enormous psychological pressure, who had reached the end of her emotional resources. Whether her death was entirely natural or whether she hastened it somehow, we'll never know. But I believe she died as she lived, trying to control the consequences of her choices." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the complex moral landscape that the case had revealed. "Miss Marple," the Reverend said eventually, "what do you think the ultimate lesson is in all this? What should we learn from Miss Fullerton's tragedy?" Miss Marple looked out at her garden, where the spring flowers were pushing through the dark soil, bringing new life after winter's death. "I think the lesson is that truth, however painful, is preferable to the most comfortable lie." Miss Fullerton spent 30 years living with a false version of her family's history, and when that falsehood was finally exposed, she found herself incapable of accepting reality. If she had been willing to face the truth about her father from the beginning, none of the subsequent tragedy would have been necessary. She paused, then continued more thoughtfully, "But I also think there's a lesson about forgiveness, both of others and of ourselves." Miss Fullerton couldn't forgive her father for being less than perfect, and she couldn't forgive herself for having believed in his innocence. That inability to accept human fallibility ultimately destroyed her. As the Reverend prepared to leave, Miss Marple returned to her letter to Raymond, determined to capture the essential truth of what they had all learned. In the end she wrote, "This case reminded me that every family carries secrets, and every generation must decide what to do with the secrets they inherit. We can choose to perpetuate deceptions,
or we can choose to face the truth and work to make amends for past wrong. Miss Fullerton made the wrong choice, but even in her failure she ultimately found a way to restore what her father had taken. Perhaps that's the most any of us can hope for, the chance to leave the world a little better than we found it, despite our own mistakes and limitations. Miss Marple sealed the letter and set it aside, then returned to Miss Fullerton's journal. There was still more to read, more to understand about the woman who had brought tragedy to their peaceful village on Christmas Eve. But that was a task for another day. For now it was enough to sit in her garden, surrounded by the evidence of spring's renewal, and reflect on the eternal human struggle between truth and deception, between the people we are and the people we wish we had been. The bells of Mary Mead Church began to ring the noon hour, their clear notes carrying across the village like a call to honesty, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Even in the aftermath of murder, life continued, and with it the hope that wisdom might be gained from tragedy. Miss Marple smiled and went inside to prepare lunch, leaving Miss Fullerton's journal open on the garden table, its pages fluttering in the gentle spring breeze, like prayers offered up to a forgiving sky.